And welcome to Practical Programming, a class that we've been doing for a little while. Today, I'm going to start off by clarifying a few things. And I don't know, some of you may or may not have been able to watch the last class online. I didn't post it until earlier today, so if not, that's okay. But one question that someone asked me that was a good question was kind of about HTML attributes. So let's say you have a link or an anchor tag, and they're all kind of, the anchor tag always seems to come in the same way. The tag, there's an href, there's the value, and so it kind of leads you to think, well, could I do something like this? Like, could I make a span tag with an href, and does that take me to example.com? And the answer is no. The href is an attribute that's only available on anchor tags. And I guess it's kind of into a more broad discussion of there are some attributes that are only available on certain tags. So href is only available on an anchor tag. I'm trying to think of some more examples. HTML attributes kind of in this form are not used as often as they used to be because a lot of their functionality has been displaced by CSS and JavaScript. So in this case, if you ever are wondering, well, what attributes does an element have or does a tag have, you can always just, there's a ton of different sites. If you just search for them, you just search, HTML, anchor, href, it would show you that attribute and then also show you the other attributes as well. So with that, I think another question I had that someone asked that I actually don't have on the slides, but it was talking about CSS from the last class. Is there some way that we tell the browser that there's going to be CSS on the page? And the answer is, up until now, we've been doing CSS strictly through style attributes. And style attributes are, interestingly, available on all elements. So you can style any HTML element. So whenever you have a style attribute and it's automatically assumed that what goes in between the quotes is CSS. So you don't have to say the following is CSS because it's assumed. And we're going to learn a new way to define CSS in a document. And you're going to see how much easier it makes everything. I mean, because I was really tired last class of typing style equals. So it's been a long time since I've done that too. Any questions just about anchor tags, elements, what attributes they have?
I watched the video from Tuesday, so I can jump in. Better, you probably explained it in that, but I noticed that in the finished file you had everything was in line. Why was it in line?
So the question was, why were all of the styles in line on the finished document from Tuesday? We're going to go over not inline styles today. So that's one of the things that I was thinking about is it's a little bit more of a jump from just learning the properties to be able to define how to access the elements. Yeah, it was very difficult and painful for me to type the whole time.
Oh no, why? What are we doing?
Yeah. Okay.
The font family, you put 3 different font families. That's just to make sure that the font that's used in that browser is picked up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question is, why are there more than one family listed in the font family attribute or CSS property? And that's because, yeah, not all browsers have all fonts. So you list the fonts in the order that you would like the browser to use them, and if it has it, then it'll use it. If it doesn't, then it goes to the next one. So reviewing some CSS properties that we went over Tuesday. Just making sure that we all remember. This is going to be kind of where I'm going over things where you may remember, you may not, but this is reinforcement, I think. So the first two are width and height, and I have this box that I made that's going to be my illustration box. So width and height are fairly obvious. If you give it at least a block element, a width and height, then the height is the height and the width is the width. And it can be measured in pixels, it can be measured in percentages. There's a couple of different kinds of measurements too, but we'll stay with pixels and percentages for now. There is margin. And margin, I know I talked about it a little bit on Tuesday, but margin is, if you can imagine the box pushing itself away from other things is the margin. So you can see in the illustration, I hope you guys can read it, but there's margin top, margin right, margin bottom, and margin left. And there's a short form. All of those are actual CSS properties. So you could do, margin dash right, colon, 10 pixels. And that would give your element a right margin of 10 pixels. But there's also a short form, which is just margin, and then those are, it's margin, colon, and then you have the top, right, bottom, and left. And I don't have that on the side, but you guys can check that out for yourselves when you get tired of typing margin right and margin left. So another kind of property that we talked about was padding. And I described padding as the element pushing in on its own contents. So I didn't specify all of the padding attributes. There's padding right, padding left, just like margin. But it's just another way to get alignment of things. So if you want, there are different cases, and I think in Tuesday's class we had times when we wanted padding and times when we wanted margin. But the best thing to know is that, to remember, is just that padding is the element kind of pushing in on itself, and margin is the element pushing out on other things. Text align is one that we used, and it's pretty self-explanatory. But you can have text align left, which would align your text on the left side of the box, or right, which would align your text on the right, and text align center, which aligns text in the center. And text align center is also used a lot for styling inline elements. So if you said text align center, for instance, you could center an image as well. So text align is probably best described as inline align, and all inline elements and text within a containing element are centered. Font size is pretty self-explanatory. Changing the font size makes the font bigger. Continuing with the other font properties, there's font weight. The most traditional font weight that you're going to use is just bold, and it makes the text bold. If you wanted to change the font style to italic, there is font style italic, and that gets you the italicized text that we needed partially on Tuesday. There's text decoration if you wanted to give the text an underline. And text decoration, I think, actually breaks what I said about how to remember whether something was a font property or a text property. because I had said that font properties were what changed the text directly, and text properties were what changed like inline elements. Which I guess this actually still sticks. If you had text decoration underlined, an image would be underlined. So it still sticks. Okay, I'm pleased. So that gives us the underlined and bold text. Now, underline is one text decoration. It's probably the one that you'll use the most. If you have something that is underlined, like anchor tags come underlined by default, you can turn off the underline with text decoration none. And that gives us no underline. Of course, because there's like 3 different ways to do everything at Supply, Ben didn't like, Ben, our CEO, Ben, if you're listening, great shout out. He didn't like the look of the text decoration underlined. So he did everything. We underlined all text with bottom borders, which gives you like a really nice underline. It takes a little more work, but it's worth it at the end. So yeah, right. Okay, so if we were going to get rid of the italicized text, then you would use font style normal. So really what I'm just trying to show you here is how you would go about italicizing if something is italicized. For instance, if you want the majority of the text in an element italicized, but you want one part of it to not be italicized, how would I turn it off? And you would just use font style normal. And that's what it turned off. And if we want the font weight to go back to how it was, then we use font weight normal.
Is your font pixels related with points system, like what the graphic designers use, like the 24 pixels is related to 24 points?
Mm-hmm. So the question is, are pixels related to points? The best answer I can give right now is yes and no, maybe. Points, you can't actually size things in CSS in points. And pixels, I think, were originally a derivation of another form of measurement. And I think, at least initially, they also represented actual...
Pixels was graphics because then points was more for vector thing.
Mm-hmm. Right. Pixels are no longer directly mapped to the actual pixels on the screen. So, yeah. At this point...
So it's pretty close, like, between, like 24 points, if the guy gives a size of text like 24 points, like we get 24 pixels, it should be pretty close. Right?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not entirely sure. But the good thing is that you could probably get on CodePen and play around with it and see what it looked like. And I would encourage everyone, if you have questions like that, you can ask me, and if I don't know them, I'll just tell you to play on CodePen. So I think we're rounding out the font family, which actually isn't, which no pun intended for what I'm about to show, but the family of font properties, font family is one that you'll also be using. I have some simple examples. A serif font, if you wanted to use a serif, you just say font family serif. And then I give you the serif text. If you wanted a sans serif font, then you can say font family sans serif. And font family also accepts actual names of fonts. Helvetica is one that a lot of people use, very readable, blah, blah, blah. It's available on a lot of Macs. Times New Roman is used in some places. But I guess we did talk about this a little earlier. But font family, the fonts are used in the order that you give them. If the browser has them, it uses it. If not, it goes on to the next one. And one thing that I haven't mentioned that none of these properties have been quoted, like the property, like for instance, font family, like sans serif isn't in quotes or anything. But if you do have a value with a space, then it's good to quote those. So if you have a font name that has a space, then you would need to quote it. And text transform, it's one that we talked about Tuesday. You can transform text to uppercase, and there's obviously the inverse, which is lowercase, and that gives you the lowercase text. So that's kind of a rundown of the properties that we went over on Tuesday that we use when building a page. Really weren't that many, weren't that complicated. We used float, which is one that may or may not have its own class. I'm kind of deciding when we go over that, but I posted an article on practicalprogramming.org just talking about looking closer at the float property. It's something that I think is probably one of the harder concepts to grasp, is how is an element going to affect the page if it's floated. So, with all that said, there's a lot of stuff. That's not an exhaustive list of properties by any means. It's one that we use when making that page, and I think going through your careers as CSS front-end developers that you already are, you're going to run through those quite a bit. So, as someone had already said, goodness, Tuesday's code was tedious. Now we're going to talk about CSS selectors. So initially, when the web was created on the first day, Mark Andreessen wrote on a mailing list. No, it was for academics, and a lot of the initial usage you have to think about was for academics. There wasn't a need for pretty images. There wasn't a need. Initially the web didn't even have images. It wasn't until literally Mark Andreessen wrote on a mailing list and said, "Hey, I'd like to propose this tag called image. We'll just abbreviate it IMG." So there also wasn't a lot of need for style. So it wasn't until later that CSS was even developed, and initially HTML was, you could change the style mostly by attributes on different elements. So that was kind of well and good, but everyone kind of, once you start getting a project of any size, you're like, man, this is a lot of, if I have 3 different pages on my site, and if I want to change the header that's on all the pages, I have to copy and paste every time. That would suck. And it did for a long time, probably, until all browsers supported it. But repetitiveness is one of the things that make the way that we were doing CSS on Tuesday really bad. And we didn't even really get the style tag until after CSS was created, and I guess they didn't learn their lesson. So, knowing what you know now, if I gave you a set of 4 divs and I said, okay, let's make the font size 14 pixels. This is probably what you'd be doing. Granted, you could also wrap those in a containing div and really stick it to me, but for now we'll go with this example. And that's boring. Having to style everything with style equals, give me the properties, and everything is so repetitive, that's boring. And if you learn anything in this class, you should learn that if it feels repetitive, there's probably a better way. And if there's not a better way, then as lazy programmers, we would spend our free time making a better way. And then we could be lazy again. So there's a way better way, and it's made possible by 2 new HTML attributes, class and ID. And it's a little bit of a lie, it's actually also kind of made possible by the tag names. So I don't want to get ahead of myself. So the class attribute, it's just like anything else. You're kind of like, oh great, style equals, now it's class equals. What's the difference? Well, if you give a class to an element, a class is like something that is not necessarily unique to a site. It's something that is shared. So if I had a couple of paragraphs, like on the blog, the blog article that we were working on Tuesday, I could give all of those paragraph tags the same class, and it would let me style them all as one unit, because there's a lot of shared functionality between. You can also give an element multiple classes, and they're just separated by spaces. So I don't think I have a slide for this, but if you wanted to add a class called second-class, then you would just say class equals, quote, first class, space, second class, close quote. And you can add unlimited classes to an element, which leads to some like really nifty, the ability to reuse components. So you could give an element two classes. One is normal text, and then one is add a class to the first paragraph that is, intro paragraph, and it, one indents it, and then one gives it the text size and all that different stuff. You'll see as we go along. Second new attribute that we have that is available on all elements starting today is ID. An ID is a specific identifier for a single specific element. In general, I think when you are thinking, should I use an ID or should I use a class? It's okay if you just always use a class. I don't think anybody has ever been like, man, I really should have used an ID there. But you can't, you can only have one ID per element, but an element can have an ID and a class, and multiple classes. So an ID is like pretty limiting. It should only be used in pretty specific cases of where I know that this is so different and so unique that we're going to style it with an ID. So now that we've pretty much said, well, we're not going to be typing style equals anymore, where do all of your styles go? We have a new HTML tag, which is style. The style tag gives you three ways to target elements. There's actually way more than three, but three that we're going to go over today. So you can target elements by class. So when you target elements by class, there's really only a little bit of syntax that you need to remember. And that is that you have, well, I'm not going to explain this yet. You can also target by ID. And this is an example of targeting by ID. And you can target by tag name. And so that's an example of targeting by tag name. So let's break it down a little bit. And this is targeting by tag name. This is the example that we just showed. So the first thing is that there's the style tag, the opening style tag. There is the selector. And in this case, the selector is the tag name, which is div. It could also be a class. And when you want to select by a class, the only syntax that you need to remember is that a class name is prepended with a period. I don't know if that's easy to see on the slides or not, but if I wanted to style an element that had the class, first class, then in the CSS selector, I would say period, first class, And that's how you let CSS know that you're targeting a class and not a tag name. If you're going to target or select an element based on ID, then you prepend the number sign, or a pound, or whatever it's called these days. And that's all you need to know. So at this point, the three basic ways to select an element are by tag name, and tag names don't have anything prepended to them. A class has a period prepended to it, and an ID has a number sign or pound prepended to it. And after the selector, you have an open bracket, and then a regular CSS property. So anything that you would have put inside style equals, you can put inside this selector. And then you also have the closing style tag. Now, you can also have multiple properties inside of the selector. So at this point, we have font size and font weight. There's an unlimited number of properties that you could have inside. And if you wanted to select a couple of different things, like for instance, if you had two classes that you wanted to select, if there were two different classes and you wanted to have two different styles for them, then inside the style block, you would just, if you had this block right here and you wanted to add a different selector for first class, then you would just go to a new line after the closed bracket, and you would add your new selector, which in this case would be period first dash class, and then open your brackets, put your properties, and then close it. So you only need one set of style tags, and then within the style tags you can have an unlimited amount of selectors, and within the selectors you can have an unlimited amount of properties. So that was a quick run through. Now, any questions? Any questions just about that? I'm going to go through and do some stuff from yesterday, or from Tuesday. Yes?
So I understand multiple classes, one ID, have a tag versus class. Why would you want to go?
So in the very easy cases that we're using right now, where you only have one element that's easy to target, you could use a tag or a class. It doesn't really matter. But if you were targeting something that either was like harder to target, or you wanted to apply kind of like multiple components, then it would be better to go with classes. And in some cases, tags are so specific. It's hard to explain without actually doing it. But in
like IDs in very specific cases,
sorry, say that again.
Are tags used in more specific cases than what IDs would be?
So the question is, are tags used in specific cases kind of like IDs? I guess it all kind of depends. If for instance, one of the things that a lot of people load as far as like CSS in their projects is a normalization style sheet. So it will go through and apply a normalized style to all elements on a page. So those styles target tags. So it gives all tags kind of a predictable, visible, predictable like visual layout on the page across browsers. In general, I don't really use tag selectors as often as classes, but you'll get a feel. It's kind of like if you are doing a project and you think, well, I could really just knock this out by styling all of the p tags inside this div. Yeah, and we'll see as we keep going, but you can also select classes, and then select only the tags inside elements with those classes. So they all kind of work themselves out into some utility. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the document that we were working on Tuesday and change some of the CSS styles that were all the styles equals, blah, blah, blah. And I'm going to change those to using selectors. And hopefully that gives you guys kind of a feel for how you would use selectors in one of your own projects.